화면이 안 나오지?
자, 여러분 안녕하세요.
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 네, 반갑습니다. 네, 2주 동안 잘 지내셨죠?
네,
네, 뭐 잘 지내신 것 같습니다. 네, 지난 시간은 네, 이제 동영상 강의로 수업을 진행했고, 네, 서로 잘 확인하신 바와 같이 네, 인공지능 윤리와 관련된 그러니까 기본적인 내용들 또 이제 그러니까 쟁점과 현안으로 떠오르고 있는 이제 여러 주제들을 잘 정리한 이제 강의였고 또 이제 보니까 여러분들 내용을 잘 이해하셔서 잘 팔로우를 하신 것 같습니다. 여러 가지 이제 토론의 내용과 또 이제 질문들의 내용이 잘 정리된 것 같아서 네, 보기가 아주 좋았습니다. 그리고 이제 예고된 대로 이제 오늘은 원래 8시부터 네, 저와 같이 작년에 강의를 했던 로버트 지카리 교수님을 모시고 이제 특강을 듣기로 했고요. 그 특강은 지금 8시부터로 예정되어 있는데 지카리 교수님 보니까 지금 조금 일찍 들어와 계신 것 같습니다. 제가 조금 후에 정식으로 소개를 드리고 강의를 진행하도록 하겠습니다. 어, 부득이 외국인이셔서 제가 그때 잠깐 네, 저도 외국어를 사용하더라도 네, 음, 네, 이해하시기 바랍니다. 그러면 조금 네, 로버트 지카리 교수님 이제 강의를 기다리는 동안 이제 지난 시간 네, 거피 교수인가요? 박사님의 이제 강의에 대한 내용 정리, 약간 토론을 하고 워밍업을 좀 하도록 하겠습니다. 제 강의 내용에 대해서는 이제 다 잘들 정리를 해주신 것 같고요. 네. 지금 네, 지카리 교수님이 저한테 언제 시작하냐고 문자 물어보셔서 제가 답장을 하고 있습니다. 자, 우리 박유준 학생, 네, 강의 내용과 또 들으면서 정리된 생각들을 조금 나눠주실까요?
예, 들리시나요?
네,
예,
잘 들립니다.
예, 먼저 그 교수님 강의에서 두 가지 파트로 나눠서 말씀해 주셨는데 첫 번째는 AI 윤리라는 거 얘기하기 앞서서 일단 윤리가 뭔지에 대해서 얘기를 하셨었는데 좀 뭐랄까 뭐 뒤에 물론 이제 AI에 관련된 얘기를 한 것도 뭐 인상 깊었지만은 사실 AI 윤리라고 할 때 윤리가 뭔지부터 정의를 하고 들어가는 게 맞는데 너무 당연하게 그동안 생각했던 것 같아서 거기서 조금 한 방 맞은 것 같은 약간 느낌이 들었습니다. 강의를 들으면서. 그래서 윤리라는 걸 이제 특히 이제 세 가지 관점에서 뭐 아리스토텔레스의 덕윤리랑 뭐 칸트의 의무론이랑 이제 그다음에 이제 결과주의 이 관점에서 어떤 윤리를 보는 우리의 세 가지 측면에 대해서 이제 설명을 해주시고 근데 우리가 이제 윤리적 평가를 할 때 이 세 가지 이론은 결국 다 사용하면서 평가를 하는데 궁극적으로는 뭐랄까 윤리라는 거를 우리가 하나로 정의하기가 좀 힘든 것 같다 뭐 이런 생각이 이제 들었습니다. 강의를 들으면서. 근데 이제 뭐랄까 제가 들었던 생각은 그 이런 어떤 가치라는 측면, 윤리라는 측면을 우리 인간도 어떤 이상적인 뭔가 하나로 이렇게 일반화해서 정의할 수가 없는 건데 예컨대 뭐 공정성이라는 가치를 얘기할 때도 어떤 게 공정성인가에 대해서 수많은 생각이 있고 그거에 대해서 우리가 일률적으로 이렇게 정할 수가 없는데 AI 윤리를 논하면서 뭔가 일반화된 스탠다드를 만들고 기준을 만든다는 것 자체가 그 이제 예컨대 뭐 그 트롤리 딜레마 같은 경우도 그걸 결국에 어떻게 이제 해결할 건지 이런 구체적인 사례에 적용하기 위해서는 뭔가 하나의 결론을 내리고 그거에 맞춰서 이렇게 해야 되는데 그거 자체가 이제 정의하기가 힘든 상황에서 뭔가 근본적으로 이런 연역적인 방식을 통해서 현실의 구체적 사례에서 결론을 낼 수 있는 답을 낼 수 있는 스탠다드를 만드는 것 자체가 가능한가 하는 좀 근본적인 의문이 들었습니다. 네. 그러고 또 하나 생각이 든 거는 네네 일단 뭐 말이 너무 길어질 것 같아서 여기까지 하겠습니다. 네.
네, 좋습니다. 뭐 근본적인 의문을 제기하면서 또 관련된 내용들을 또 잘 정리를 해주신 것 같습니다. 그리고 우리 김영신 변호사, 네,
네.
어떤가요?
네. 먼저 변호사님께서 잘 정리해 주신 바대로 저도 첫 번째 부분 강의를 들으면서 저도 뭐 인공지능에 대해서 논할 때 뭐 윤리적이다, 윤리적이지 않다 이런 말들을 흔히 하는데 과연 그 윤리라는 거의 자체에 대해서 어떻게 뭐 생각해 볼지에 대해서는 이제 처음 이렇게 강의를 들으면서 생각을 해보게 된 거고 또 윤리와 관련된 어떤 이제 그 특정 상황에서 윤리적인가 아닌가를 그 평가를 할 수 있는 어떤 기준이 되는 사고의 틀 자체를 이제 좀 배웠다는 점에서 되게 강의가 인상 깊었던 것 같습니다. 이제 첫 번째 부분은 그렇게 진행이 된 것 같고 또 이제 그 교수님께서 두 번째 강의 부분에서는 AI와 이제 그 윤리 부분을 이제 AI에 어떻게 적용할 것인가에 대해서 말씀을 주시면서 이제 워낙 뭐 AI가 물론 이제 다 좋게 윤리적이면 좋고 이제 범국가적인 다 뭐 어떤 가치들 예를 들어 뭐 개인정보 보호라든지 뭐 인권이라든지 뭐 그런 가치들이 있을 텐데 이거를 항상 이렇게 막 지켜야 한다 이렇게 강요를 하는 것이 현실적으로 가능한가 특히 이제 마켓이라는 시장 이제 원리를 따라 보면은 시장에서는 또 그만큼 AI라는 것을 개발하는 사람의 뭐 이제 이해관계도 있을 거고 정부의 이해관계도 있을 거고 이렇게 다양한 플레이어들의 이제 이해관계가 복잡하게 얽혀 있는데 이러한 이제 그 복잡 다양한 상황을 다 조화롭게 어떻게 이제 다그 합의하에 어떤 우리가 이러한 가치관을 지키자라고 해서 통일적으로 하나의 어떤 그런 가치를 정의하는 게 사실 굉장히 어렵고 또 강의에서는 그런 기준을 설립하는 것 자체가 불가능할 것 같다라고도 말씀 주실 만큼 힘든 문제라는 거를 조금 이해를 하게 된 것 같습니다. 또 이 포인트와 관련해서도 어쨌든 굉장히 뭐 힘들고 불가능한 일일 것 같지만 어떻게 보면은 이제 시장에 각 당사자들이 참여하는 그런 환경이 있는 만큼 한편으로는 이제 뭐 AI를 개발하는 자들의 조금 그런 입장에서는 규제를 조금 완화하려는 유인이 있을 거고 또 다른 한편으로는 또 규제를 조금 설립을 함으로써 이렇게 좀 범국가적인 가치관을 조금 이제 설립을 하자 이런 이 두 가지 양측의 요인이 조금 대비되고 이를 어떻게 조화롭게 잘 융합시킬까에 대한 문제인 것 같은데 뭐 장단기적으로 조금 이런 문제들을 어떻게 나아가서 좀 살펴볼까에 대해서 조금 더 고민을 해본 시간인 것 같습니다. 네.
네, 좋습니다. 윤혜원, 지난 시간에 우리 비디오를 못 켰던 것 같은데요. 네, 간단히 자기소개 한 번 더 부탁드리고 네, 디스커션 부탁드릴까요?
네. 지금 들리시나요?
네, 잘 들립니다.
네. 저는 윤혜원이고 지금 대법원에서 재판연구관으로 근무하고 있습니다. 행정법 전공이고 현재 박사과정을 최기환 교수님 밑에서 하고 있습니다. 잘 부탁드리겠습니다. 그리고 지난 강의에 대한 얘기를 조금 덧붙이면 될까요?
네,
네.
좋습니다.
네. 저는 사실 그 올린 글 그대로인데 제가 올린 글에서는 이제 구글의 AI 윤리를 검색했을 때 나오는 말들이 사실은 얼마나 추상적이고 어떻게 보면 좀 공허한 개념에 머무를 수 있는지를 얘기를 하면서 이 강의를 통해서 그런 개념들을 구체화하기 위해서 좋은 질문을 던질 수 있으면 좋겠고 또 그 과정 속에서 좋은 질문을 통해서 어떤 관계 집단의 이해관계 실현을 정당화하는 도구에 머무르지 않는 어떤 윤리 개념을 찾아가면 좋겠다라는 이야기를 제 글에서 했었는데요. 또 한편으로 드는 생각은 그 좋은 질문이라는 것도 결국은 관계 집단의 이해관계 실현과 무관할 수 없는 것이 아닌가. 그리고 질문을 던지는 것 자체가 어떤 이해관계 툴 안에서 이루어지는 작업이 아닌가라는 생각이 들어서 관계 집단의 이해관계 자체를 떠나서 어떤 더 좋은 무언가라는 걸 갈 수 있는 것인지 그 개념 자체가 성립할 수 있는 것인지에 대한 의문을 다시 좀 갖게 되었습니다. 그렇다면 관계 집단의 이해관계 실현과 무관하지 않으면서도 어떤 모두의 니즈를 만족시키고 최소한의 어떤 윤리 감각에 어긋나지 않는 뭔가를 찾아나갈 수 있는 방법이 있을지 있다면 그게 무엇일지 앞으로의 강의를 들으면서 좀 더 고민해 볼 수 있었으면 좋겠습니다.
네, 좋습니다. 네, 좋습니다. 그리고 나머지 친구들은 지난 시간에 다 간단히 소개들을 했던 것 같은데요. 우리 유지수는 오늘 처음 여기 강의실에 들어왔는데 네, 간단히 자기소개 좀 부탁할까요? 네, 안 들리는 것 같습니다. 유지수? 네, 저 마이크 커넥션에 약간 문제가 있는 것 같고요. 한번 네, 고쳐보시기 바랍니다. 나중에 해결이 되면 저 문자로 알려주세요. 네. 그리고 한두 분 정도 더, 네, 최지원 변호사 어떤가요?
네. 교수님, 저도 지난 시간에 소개를 못 드렸었는데, 네,
맞아요.
안녕하세요. 저는 허정욱 교수님 지도를 받아서 현재 행정법 박사과정에 재학 중인 최지원 변호사라고 합니다. 이번 학기 잘 부탁드립니다. 저희 동영상 강의 들은 것과 관련해서 다른 분들께서 말씀해 주신 것과 저도 비슷한 맥락의 생각을 해보았는데요. 일단 누가 AI 윤리 기준을 만들 것이고 글로벌 가버넌스가 가능할지 이런 논의를 들으면서 사실 앞서서 여러 이해관계 집단들이 있는데 어떠한 규범을 만들어야 될지에 있어서 어려움이 많을 것 같다는 얘기들을 해주셨는데 제가 생각할 때도 AI 규범을 만들 때는 많은 난점이 있을 것 같다는 생각을 해보았습니다. 우선 AI 규율에 대해 논의할 때 전체로서 접근할지 분야별 AI에 대해 따로 접근할지 더 나아가서 AI가 만약에 인간의 통제 범위를 벗어날 때는 규율 대상이 누가 되어야 하고 무엇이 되어야 할지라는 생각 등을 다양하게 해볼 수 있었고, 또 하나 생각했던 것이, 그러니까 제가 지난 학기 교수님 수업 들으면서 연구했던 내용 중에 하나가 이제 기후 문제라는 어떤 새로운 국제적인 이슈가 등장했을 때 이것의 규범을 어떻게 가져가야 하는지에 대해서 아직까지 논의들이 완전히 확립되었다고 볼 수는 없는 상황인데, AI 문제는 어떻게 보면 기후변화 문제보다도 더 최근에 부각되는 문제로서 이 규범을 만들어 가는 데 있어서 어떻게 접근해야 하고 각 주체들이 어떠한 역할을 수행할 수 있는지에 대한 논의가 아직 많이 부족하기 때문에 아직 열린 영역이라는 그런 생각이 많이 들었고, 앞으로 많은 입법적 난항들도 있을 수 있겠다는 생각을 하게 되었습니다. 그리고 강연자분께서 제시해 주셨던 마지막 아이디어가 있었는데, AI 관련 법적 틀을 만드는 것보다 윤리 기준을 적용하는 것이 보다 신속하고 용이한 방법일 수 있겠다는 식의 논의를 해 주셨었는데, 물론 이 부분에 대해서 동의하는 바도 있긴 하지만 AI 관련 행위들을 규율하기 위해서 통일된 기준이 필요한 상황인데, 이때 강제력이 없고 개인마다 기준이 정말 다를 수밖에 없는 윤리로 법규를 대체할 수 있을지 이러한 의문도 가져보게 되었습니다. 다른 내용들은 다른 분들께서 생각해 주신 것과 비슷해서 이 정도로 생각하겠습니다.
네, 좋습니다. 뭐 제가 랜덤으로 부탁드렸는데도 다 잘 정리해서 도움이 되는 코멘트를 해주신 것 같습니다. 그래서 이제 AI ethics 또는 이제 인공지능 윤리 또는 이제 규제의 이슈는 이제 지난 수업 시간 말미에 이제 제가 말씀드린 바와 같이 뭐 이미 잘 느끼고 있는 바와 같이 고도로 매우 빠른 속도로 발전하고 있는 이제 인공지능 기술 의 변화 영역, 또 이제 그 변화가 이제 인간들의 이제 삶에 미치는 영향들이 이미 이제 체감으로 느끼고 있고요. 그 이제 뭐 이제 기술의 발전은 늘 있었습니다만 이제 다른 분야, 다른 종류의 기술과 달리 이제 AI는 많은 부분에 있어서 이제 고유한 이제 인간의 전유한 영역이라고 생각되었던 이제 의사 결정 또는 이제 선택의 상황에서 판단의 문제를 이제 대체해 나가고 있다는 것이 특성인 것 같습니다. 이제 그 맥락에서 과연 이제 기술적으로는 이제 뭐 끊임없이 이제 발전해갈 그 AI가 과연 이제 어디까지 인간의 영역을 대체하고 또는 인간의 판단을 대체할 할 수 있는 것인지, 좀 그래서 대체된 기술적 의사결정이 과연 얼마나 우리가 이제 받아들일 수 있을 것인지 문제의 맥락으로 이제 등장을 하고 있는 것 같습니다. 그리고 이제 이미 체감으로 또는 이제 많은 이제 영화에서 이제 느낀 바와 같이 이제 대략 어떤 미래가 펼쳐질지 이렇게 짐작되는 상황에서 이게 그냥 마냥 기술적 진보를 그냥 자유방임으로 두고 그 속에서 그냥 인간이 자유롭게 살면 되겠다가 아니라 이제 매우 큰 뭔가 두려움과 불안함, 불확실성 속에서 뭐 나름의 공포 이제 이런 것들이 혼재되어 있는 것 같습니다. 자, 그래서 어떤 식으로든 이제 규범적 통제를 해야 되지 않을까라는 이제 의견의 합치들이 이루어지고 있는 것 같고요. 근데 이제 결국 그 규범이라고 하면 또 이제 법이라고 하면 또 이제 그 법적 권위와 권한의 발동으로서 이제 최종적으로 규제라는 형식으로 이 개인들의 선택에 이제 제약을 가하는 것은 결국 이제 그 시민 사회의 형성 또 이제 시민 혁명 이후에 이제 대부분의 이제 민주주의 국가에서 이제 뭐 당연하고 이제 매우 기본적이고 중요한 가치라고 생각하고 있는 시민으로서 개인들의 자유와 권리에 대한 국가의 이제 간섭이나 개입 또는 이제 제한의 형태로 또는 새로운 의무의 부과가 이루어지는 형태로 최종적으로 이제 작동이 된다는 것이죠. 그 막연한 상태에서는 뭐 국가가 뭘 더 많이 해야 되고 뭐 공정과 정의를 달성해야 되고 뭐 이렇게 하지만 이제 그 최종적인 단계에서 누군가 개인에게 구체적인 권리의 박탈과 의무의 부과의 형태로 나타나면 다들 매우 민감해지는 것이죠. 그래서 이제 그와 같은 이제 법규상을 정하는 방식에 대해서 민주주의 또는 이제 민주적 정당성 또는 이제 절차적 정당성을 어떻게 확보할 것인지를 놓고 이제 끊임없이 고민해온 것이 민주주의 발전의 이제 역사였던 것이고, 이제 그것에 관한 이제 나름의 우리는 이제 규범 체계를 갖고 있는 것이죠. 또는 이제 법적 문제를 고민하고 해결해 나가는 이제 나름의 루틴을 이제 갖고 있는 것이죠. 근데 이제 워낙 이 분야가 이제 새로운 분야이니까 어떤 규범이 있어야 되고 어떻게 작동해야 되고에 관해서 이제 너무나 이제 불확실하니까 지금은 바로 이제 인공지능법, 뭐 인공지능에 대한 규제 또는 인공지능에 의한 규제, 뭐 이런 이제 다이렉트한 그러니까 규범적 표현을 가는데 조금 조심스러운 것 같아요. 왜냐하면 이제 그걸 통해서 최종적인 이제 권리와 의무의 귀속이 어떻게 될 것인지에 대해서 너무나 이제 불완전한 정보를 갖고 있기 때문인 것이고요. 이제 그러다 보니까 이제 그걸 향해서 가는 이제 중간 단계로서 ethics 또 이제 윤리의 개념 또 이제 내용들이 등장을 하는 것이고, 그러니까 다분히 이제 약간 추상적으로 메타하게 간접적으로 야 그래도 뭐 기술적 발전이 있겠지만 뭐 대략의 이제 범위를 정해줘야 되는 거 아니야? 뭐 어디까지 되고 어디까지 안 되는지를 이제 고민하고 정해줘야 되는 거 아니야? 이제 이런 게 이제 논의의 시작인 것 같고요. 근데 이제 그 맥락에서 말씀드린 대로 어떤 규범의 영역에 있어서 규범의 문제를 고민함에 있어서 윤리라는 단어, 뭐 도덕, 뭐 또는 이제 뭐 종교 이런 가치적 개념들이 등장하는 것은 생각보다는 위험한 일일 수 있고 사실 이제 인류가 쭉 경험을 해왔던 것이죠. 어떤 종교적 신념이나 가치 또는 도덕적 가치 또는 이제 윤리적 가치가 공동체를 규율하는 이제 규범적 효력을 갖게 되어서 이제 그것으로부터 직접 개인에 대한 어떤 자유나 권리의 박탈로 이어지게 되는 세상에서 사실 얼마나 많은 뭐랄까 비극적인 상황들이 또 이제 그 도덕이나 윤리관념이라는 것이 쉽게 이제 의사합치가 될 수 없는 영역들이 있기 때문에 그 마지막 순간까지 그 내용에 동의를 하지 못하면서 어떤 국가에 의한 강제력의 상대방이 되는 이제 상황들이 많았고 이제 비극으로 이어졌고 이런 것들이 경험이기 때문에 그 후에 이제 법이나 규범의 문제를 고민함에 있어서 이제 규범의 정당성을 논하면서 그 근거로 윤리, 도덕 또는 종교가 등장하지 않기 위해서 매우 노력들을 많이 해왔던 것이죠. 근데 이제 그런 맥락에서 보면 이제 최종적으로 인공지능과 관련된 규범적 체계와 내용을 고민하면서 먼저 이제 AI Ethics란 이름으로 논의가 이제 진행되는 것은 꽤 흥미롭기도 하고 또 다분히 매우 이제 불안정한 이제 면도 있는 것 같습니다. 아마 이제 비슷한 내용이 이제 그 에마누엘 거피 박사 이제 강의에서도 뭐 제시가 됐던 것 같고요. 관련된 내용들을 잘 이해를 하신 것 같습니다. 유지수 혹시 연결이 됐나요?
예, 제가 휴대폰으로 하니까 오디오가 나오긴 하는데, 예. 들리시나요, 혹시? 네, 죄송합니다. 제가 지금 조금 마이크 연결이 어려운 것 같아서 간단히 소개하고 끝내겠습니다. 예, 저는 허 교수님 소개받아서 이번 수업 함께한 유지수라고 합니다. 예, 지평에서 금융팀에서 에너지 인프라 파이낸싱 그리고 금융규제 팀도 업무하고 있고, 그리고 그렇게 소개받고 강의 계획서 보면서 좀 인공지능과 법이라고 이제 흥미있고 좀 시의적절한 주제를 찾을 수 있어서 감사했고, 같이 자꾸 상태가 안 좋은 것 같아서 간단히 말하고 끝내겠습니다. 즐거운 수업 같이 됐으면 좋겠습니다. 감사합니다.
네, 뭐, 네, 그 마이크가 조금 울려서, 네, 오케이. 자, 그러면 로버트 지카리 교수님을 제가 모셔보도록 하겠습니다. Hello, Robert. Do you hear me?
Hello, Sangyan. Good evening.
Here, it's very good evening and very good afternoon for you in Europe, maybe.
Thank you.
So it is very nice to invite you to my class. So it's a great pleasure and honor for us to invite you. And so such a legendary, the professionals on these topics. So actually, before you were joining, we were discussing about the AI ethics issues, and the students have watched the video lecture of Dr. Emmanuel Goffin. So they were discussing about the ethics issues and how those ethical issues or implications can be applied to AI. And so I asked the students to freely review your lectures on AI topics and your project on J inspection. So I expect and understand these students have basic understandings of your maybe background and academic engagement. So and so before introducing you to the students, so let me introduce these students to you first. So almost 30 students are all students of law school at Seoul National University. So you are expected to visit maybe this fall or next year. So, and they are all practicing or acting lawyers in Korean societies. They are acting lawyer or judges or devs. So they are quite professionals in each areas. So, and they are very much expecting your lecturing today. So for the students, I will introduce Professor Robert Jikhari. So he is now an affiliated professor at, I cannot read this wording, Ukrainovska Arcada?
Arcada, yes.
In Helsinki, Finland, and an adjunct professor at the SNU and South Korea. So he's leading a team of international experts who defined an assessment process of trustworthy AI, called GE inspections. So previously, he was professor of database and information system at the Goethe University, Frankfurt, Germany. So where he founded the Frankfurt Big Data Labs. So he's an internationally recognized expert in the field of databases and big data. So his interests also expand to ethics and AI, so innovation and entrepreneurship. So he's the editor of ODBMS Awards web portals and of the ODBMS Industry Watch blog. So he was for several years a visiting professor with the Center for Entrepreneurship and Technology within the Department of Industrial Engineering and Operations of Research at UC Berkeley, USA. So this is very short summary of Professor Robert Jikhari's bio. So now this podium is all yours, and you can freely give your lectures to students. So let's welcome Robert with big applause.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the very kind invitation, and by Sang-Yong. That's really quite nice. I'm actually also very pleased to give a lecture to law students, because I think that is really an interesting opportunity. So I have prepared two parts and maybe one optional if we ever have a time. So the first one is very short, is to give you a very short motivation of what do we need so-called trustworthy AI for. The second part, which is more the core of the lecture, is I'd like to introduce you the European Commission framework for trustworthy AI. These are guidelines that have been published. And at the end of this part, I'd like to give you a very quick introduction of the work that we've been doing in the last 3 years to take these guidelines and to put them in practice. If time permits, I could also give you a very quick introduction to the so-called European Union AI Act, which is the first ever proposed law for regulating AI. It's not a law yet, but it's a proposal, and I think that fits quite well the class here. Probably you will see that in any way in your lecture, but I think these two are the one, and this would be optional. I would say that if you have questions, you can send them in the chat or raise your hands, and if Seng-Yong, if you'll be so kind to let me know if there are questions, because I will not see them here. You can then ask questions in between or at the end, whatever you prefer. So, okay, let's start. Why do we need trustworthy AI? Well, this is a nice quote from a rather famous colleague in computer science. And it's basically saying, well, artificial intelligence is an advanced technology, has the potential of helping, like probably a very advanced technology has. And here is a very important sentence: as long as we manage to keep the technology beneficial. I put beneficial in capital here, because, what does it mean beneficial? Obviously, beneficial means you are not harming people. And you will see there's a link between trust. You trust that the technology is beneficial. So here's an example. What if the decision made using an AI-driven algorithm harms somebody, for example, in medical case, and you cannot explain how the decision was made? So this you could apply in several cases. So basically, the key question is, how do we know when AI is beneficial? Because you have basically three possibilities. You could say, well, I have an AI system and it's appropriate to be used, or it's fine. Or there are risks that have been identified, and then you can try to see whether you can, whenever possible, mitigate those risks or remedies. Or either you are not allowing this AI to be in use ahead of use, or if it's already in use and you discover that the AI is harming people, you should be able to do a so-called redress. Redress means go back and undo damage whenever it's possible. So it might not be always be possible. So these are, that's the goal. I'll try to understand when to use it or not. So the European Commission in April 2019 has published so-called ethics guidelines for trustworthy AI, made by a so-called independent high-level expert group on artificial intelligence. And the core of their work is on trust. That's why it's called trustworthy AI. It's not called ethical AI. It's not called legal AI. And basically, they are looking at the AI in various domains, looking at not only the technology, but also the social technical components involved in the AI. And basically, they define so-called guidelines. So guidelines are not law, so just suggestions. But these guidelines are based on 3 pillars. So in a AI system to be deemed to be trustworthy should have 3 properties. It should be lawful, and that really related to your class, respecting all applicable laws and regulation. You will see that laws and regulation is, in this case, our European law and regulation, because that was done by European Commission. It should be ethical, respecting ethical principles and values. One has to find these principles and values. These are abstract concepts. And it should be robust, both from a technical perspective, so engineers, but also taking into account the social environment. So that's the general statement. Now, when they did this work, where did they start from? They started with fundamental rights as a moral and legal entitlements. So that's a quote from this work. And so the European Commission is believing in an approach to AI ethics based on fundamental rights, and obviously in the context of EU treaties, the EU Charter, and international human rights law. So that's important because, as you can see from this quote, they start from the assumption that you should respect fundamental rights, you should be in a framework of democracy and the rule of law. Now, if you think about it, this is not really the case in certain area of the world where not always what is written here is fulfilling. So basically, it's important to understand that this is really in the context of the EU law and basically the charter. So I'm not a policymaker, but if you are interested in your EU treaties and EU charters, and all EU member states and institutions are legally obliged to respect when implement the EU law. So that's basically the foundation for that. And these rights are described in the EU Charter by reference to things like dignity, freedom, equality, and solidarity, citizen right, and justice. As you can see, this is very general. It will not help you to answer the question, shall I use this AI or not? But it gives a starting point. And the common foundation for all of that is really human dignity. So whatever you use the AI, the human should still be in the center in terms of respecting the dignity of the person. And also it is important to understand that why the EU Charter is legally binding, fundamental rights do not provide a comprehensive legal protection in every case. And it's important that whatever they are talking about is limited to the area of EU law. So it would be extremely interesting to, for example, compare with the Korean law and see if there are similarities or differences, because then you can see whether this framework for trustworthy AI can be applicable also to another, let's say, legal system or a kind of democracy. Important is that European Convention on Human Rights are legally binding in the EU member states. So this is really a good thing and a limitation, because basically what it says that these guidelines are actually being designed for taking into account the spirit of the European Commission. You go outside, you have different setting, you have different politics, you have different values, and it could be a challenge. So basically the 3 pillars are the following. So fundamental rights are also related to individuals and to a certain degree by group of virtues or human being. And so understood as a legally enforceable rights, fundamental rights fall in the first component of trustworthy AI, so lawful. Basically, whatever you do with AI should be compliant with the existing law. Now, the interesting thing is the AI is posing new challenges. That's why the EU is now proposing a specific law to regulate the use of artificial intelligence, because there was a gap between technology in use and the AI, which is posing new challenges. The second pillar, again, on fundamental rights, if it's understood as the rights of everyone rooted in the moral status of human being, then you are basically into the second pillar, which is called ethical AI, dealing with ethical norms that are not necessarily legally binding. As you can see, there's a second pillar. We'll talk about it. The document does not really give you guidelines for the legal part. That's why they have a separate proposal now for the legal part. So this is the foundation. Now, from this foundation, from fundamental rights, how do you go to ethical principles? So they look at ethical principle, for example, they were in biomedic, and basically they're all rooted in fundamental rights, and they come up with 4. The first one, respect for human autonomy. The second, prevention of harm. The third, fairness. You find it in medicine or in bioethics. The fourth one, explicability, is a new one. By the way, this word explicability didn't exist before. It's not explainable, explicability. So they invented a new abstract ethical principle specifically for AI. I'll show you why. Nevertheless, since an abstract principle, there might be tension between this principle. Tension means that if I have one, for example, I might not have this one here. If I have this one here, I might not have this one here. So a tension is when you have 2 values that are in conflict and you cannot have them both. And they're similar situation. So let me go quickly through this principle. These are abstract principles. The first one is the principle of respect of human autonomy. So this is again rooted in the freedom and autonomy of human beings. How do you go from the general to the AI? Well, basically, human beings interact with AI system. Now, that's a wish, must be able to keep a full and effective self-determination over themselves. Meaning, for example, if you are in medicine and you have an informed consent, you should still be able to be responsible for decisions being made and not being overruled by a machine. And it's very interesting because I use actually the word democratic process. So we assume to be in a Western democracy with all the principle and limitation of a Western democracy. So these are the things that, you know, the ethical principle should basically say, that the AI systems should not unjustifiably subordinate, coerce, deceive, manipulate, or condition or hurt humans. So that's what we don't want. No, we would like to have instead that the AI is designed to improve, augment human cognitive and social and cultural skills. So this is what we would like to have. This is the risk that we might end up having. So that's a difficult, you know, how do you distinguish between these two? Obviously, the idea would be if somebody is designing the system following a human-centric principle, then you have what you call so-called human oversight. So securing oversight so that basically the human is still kind of in control of what's going on. And the principle of prevention of harm is the second one that we are now addressing here. Of course, you know, harm, you know, is very difficult to define what harm is. here you can see AI systems should neither cause nor exacerbate harm. The first one is clear. You don't want an AI system that is actually causing trouble to people, but it could be that the trouble is already there and the AI is reinforcing this harm. And this actually is a protection of not only the physical integrity of the person, but as well the mental, the well-being, and the protection of human dignity. In this principle, you have also the technical part that basically need to be verified if the system is technically robust, if it's safe, secure, and nobody can use it for malicious use. That's prevention of harm. That's the general principle. The principle of prevention of harm as a target to protect what they call vulnerable people. Now, this is a really difficult question. Who is defining who are the vulnerable people? Normally are minorities, maybe people with disability, people with a low income, people with ethnicity. Very extremely difficult definition, because once you have defined it and then you can say, I protect those categories, what about the others one? In the States, for example, there's a lot of discussion in medicine where the certain kind of medical pills work properly for all ethnicities, so people of color or people, women and men. So you see, you can define vulnerable people in very many ways, and then you don't want them to harm. And that's basically another part of the harm that is also mentioned in this principle, that you don't want the AI system in the hands of powerhouses that are basically using the data for their own purpose in a way that is so-called asymmetrical power. So you have power concentrated in the few and the other one have it. It is very political if you think about it, because that means that few companies that owns all the data, they have a power information or information. And this principle of prevention of harm is also extended not to only the people that are involved, but also to the natural environment as well. So you see, very general. The principle of fairness is the third one, ethical principle. What they would like to say is that development, deployment, and use of AI system must be fair. Now, fair, the millions of definition of fairness going from philosophy, then if you go to a domain, for example, medicine, then you have different definition. In terms of this policy definition, fairness has two parts, a so-called substantive and a one procedural, as they call. The substantive dimension of fairness implies a commitment to equal and just distribution of both benefits and costs, and ensure that individuals and groups are free from unfair, bias, discrimination, stigmatization. As you can see here, unfair bias is already a technical term. Discrimination, everybody has a feeling about that, and stigmatization. Of course, this is basically what you don't want. And then if you would be able to avoid unfair biases, then you could have a better society. The principle of fairness is basically saying that AI systems should never lead to people being deceived or unjustifiably impaired in their freedom of choice. Freedom of choice is very typical value in Western democracy. So where the autonomy of people or the individual is very important. That could be compared with other different kind of values in different systems. Fairness implies that AI implementers should respect the principle of proportionality between means and ends, and considering carefully how to balance interests and objectives. This is a very general statement. That's the first part. The second part, called the procedural dimension of fairness, basically says that you should be able to contest and seek effective redress, so undo, against decision made using an AI system or using a system that is being part of a process where humans are making a decision, but is heavily based on the output of an AI. If this is wrong and somebody is harmed because it's not fair, then you should be able to have some accountability. So who's accountable if something is not fair or something is wrong? And that leads to the hope to be able to explain how a decision was made, because then you can say, okay, since this was made like this and that, the person accountable is this from here, because you look at the AI output, it did not really question the output, and you make a decision without understanding that the AI system was biased. That would be one way. Fairness, for those of you who are social scientists or policymakers, or is closely linked, or law students like you are, is closely linked to the rights to non-discrimination, solidarity, and justice. Now, the interesting thing is that when we show these rights to, let's say, people, not even students, that are in different disciplines, it's not even obvious to an engineer what is the difference between solidarity and justice. And that's actually the problem, because I took, a dictionary, and that's the definition that they have on non-discrimination, solidarity, and justice. Now, definition non-discrimination, the practice of treating people, companies, or even countries in the same way as others in order to be fair. Now, you're back to this definition of what is fairness. Definition of solidarity, unity as a group or a class that produces or is based on communality of interest, objectives, and standards. So that's more on the class. You protect the community. Definition of justice, I'm talking to law students, but if you talk to engineers, you need to tell them the maintenance or administration of what is just, especially by the impartial adjustment of conflicting claims or the assignment of merited rewards or punishment. One of the problems that we have is if you talk to several people, a philosopher will obviously have a completely understand of that. An engineer will likely not have any. If you ask an engineer what is the difference between solidarity and justice and non-discrimination, he will not be able to give you an answer. The fourth principle, ethical principle that is new, is called explicability. They mentioned that's a crucial building block for achieving trust in the AI system from whoever is using those. And then what they would like to have is the possibility to be able to see transparent what the AI is doing, how the decision was made, and why. Unfortunately, this explicability, which is close to responsibility and is related to justice, is not easy in AI, because most of the AI that is advanced nowadays, like deep learning and so advanced neural networks, you don't see how the system works. Now, even the engineers that design it knows how the system actually produces an output. So it's not always possible. Sometimes these are referred to a black box. You have something that comes in, this AI that has learned from example, produce an output, which is a prediction, for example, prediction that this person will have a heart attack, or prediction that this person is suffering from a lung cancer because they analyze lung pictures, but you don't tell why. So that's basically important, because in these cases, you cannot really explain. Then you have to have other ways of communicating. It could be traceability, auditability if somebody needs to do an audit, or simply to communicate. for example, if you're talking to a chatbot, a communication could be that you're informing the customer that you're not talking to a human being, you're talking to a machine. That's already a part of this principle. And this is highly dependent on the context, so in the domain. Now, these are the 4 ethical principles. Between these principles, there might be tension. So, and when there is a tension between these ethical principles, there is not a fixed solution. Now, what I found extremely interesting is this quote here. They say, okay, if you find that there is a tension, you should be able to discuss it in an accountable way into a democratic process. Now, again, we are talking about the assumption that we are in Western democracy with the democratic process where you can openly and transparently talk about possible trade-off. This is nice on paper. In practice, it's not obviously that easy. And you can see, for example, they even mention themselves. The example is the tension between the principle of prevention of harm and the principle of human autonomy. They might be in conflict. And the example is the use of AI system for predictive policing, so being used by the police to try to identify people that might actually commit the crime or their high probability to commit the crime. But in this way, if this entails surveillance, this would be against the principle of individual liberty and privacy. So then you don't have them, both of them, you don't have them. And here, if this discussion is being made public in a democratic way, there is a possibility for stakeholders to be involved. If it's actually put in secrets, then you don't have a democratic process. Anyway, having said that, all these 4 principles that you've seen will not be helpful for what they call AI practitioners, so engineers or domain experts like medical doctors or even lawyers, to basically say, okay, I make a decision, this AI is good, this AI is risky, and we should do something else. But it should actually is a way for people to start discussing in a way that is ethical. And there might be a situation where there is not an ethical acceptable trade-off that can be identified, and the system should not be used in any case. You see in the AI Act, they have it, for example, for face recognition. Now, the 4 ethical principles are now useful in practice, so they try to do something more operational, and they define 7 requirements, including sub-requirements for trustworthy AI. There are 7. The first requirement is called human agency and oversight. It includes the following sub-requirements: fundamental rights, human agency, and oversight. I'll say something for each of them. The second one is called technical robustness and safety. This includes, and then you can see it gets really technical, resilience to attack and security, fallback plan and general safety, accuracy, reliability, and reproducibility. I explained all of that. The third requirement is privacy and data governance, including respect for privacy, quality and integrity of data, and access to data. The fourth requirement is called transparency, including traceability, explainability, and communication. The fifth requirement is diversity, non-discrimination, fairness, including the avoidance of unfair bias, accessibility and universal design, and stakeholder participation. The sixth requirement is called societal environmental well-being, which is extremely general, including sustainability and environmental friendliness, social impact, society, and democracy. Extremely general. And the last one, I think you will be extremely interested, is called accountability, including auditability, minimization, reporting on negative impact, trade-off, and redress. That's really the link to also the legal part. Now, these are the 7 requirements, and their idea is that you should be continually monitor all of those, not only at the beginning, but the entire AI system lifecycle, from design to deployment to use and to dispose. So that should be like a monitoring, keep on looking at those. And it should be, it should involve different stakeholders, from engineers to domain specific to end users. So that should be part of that. That's really the wish. Now, let me go one by one so that you have an idea of what we're talking about here. So the first requirement is human agency and oversight. And this is the requirement that is really looking if the AI system is respecting fundamental rights, and what is the role of the human in the decision-making process. In a self-driving car, this is very difficult because the machine is maybe deciding to drive in a certain direction, but still the human should be able to influence a decision. In the situation of a medical doctor, that's a different situation, because you might still be able to have a second opinion. If it's already a surgery and you're using a robot as an assistant, that's just a slightly different situation, where you have a situation where the surgeon and the machine are working together, but the output is actually the way the surgery was made. And this is the principle of human autonomy, which is quite important for Western democracy. So they have basically 3 sub-requirements: fundamental rights. Basically, in certain cases of AI, you should even be doing an assessment for fundamental rights in the same way as you do it for other technology. So they even provided an example of a risk assessment for fundamental rights. And again, these are guidelines, so it is left to the vendor, the user, to decide when to do it. That could be done before the deployment, but I think it's usually important to keep a mechanism that when the system is also implemented and used, you can simply verify. Human agency is basically the requirement that a user should be able to make informed, autonomous decisions regarding the AI system. So the possibility to be still in understanding of how to make decisions. That could be quite difficult, because if you have a medical device that is AI-based, and your medical doctor is basically saying, well, listen, Mr. Lee, you have a disease, and the Mr. Lee is asking for understanding this decision, then the medical doctor might not be able to give any information, because the system that is using is a black box. Informed consent. So also key to human agency is the right not to be subjected to a decision based solely on automatic processing, when this produces illegal effects on user. Think about it, this AI is using justice system, extremely delicate. The AI system used for helping judges to make decisions on people. If the AI system is trained using biased data, or data that is not covering the entire population, you might end up having decisions that are actually legally binding, because the judge is making decision based on some unfair decision made with using AI. Extremely complicated. I'm aware of usage of AI in justice in different geography. Not all of them in Europe. I don't think in Europe we are using those yet. And it's extremely important to understand the context, and how the decision has been made. The first sub-requirements is called human oversight, which is basically to what extent the person is in control when there is an AI in the process. And they distinguish between three parts: human in the loop, human on the loop, or human in command. Okay, so the first one was human in the loop. Human on the loop refers to the capability of human intervention in every decision cycle of the system, which in many cases is neither possible nor desirable. Human on the loop refers to the capability of human intervention during the design cycle of the system and monitor the system operation. It would be like if you have a self-driving car, you let the software to decide where to go, but you can still do something. And human in control refers to the capability to oversee the overall activity of AI system. Now, not to mention that if you use AI and is not covered by this framework in military, then you can understand the implication of this human oversight. If a missile is now controlled by AI and is targeting a point without the human control, then who's accountable? I mean, military is actually, unfortunately, nowadays an extremely peculiar situation. And that basically, that in normal situation, you might decide not to use an AI in particular situation if this is the case. So that's one possibility. And basically, the whole idea is always to look for potential risk. Now, basically that goes into the operational part. So you go from the principle, you go to the requirements, and then the question is this AI posing risk? If that's the case, what are the risks and what can you do about that? The second requirement is technical robustness and safety. Again, here, the idea is to minimize potential harm, optimizing certain things like accuracy, confidence, and reliability. So this principle here is closely related to the ethical principle of prevention of harm. Now, on a technical part, they're talking to engineers. The idea is to have systems that have been implemented and designed to minimize unintentional and unexpected harm. So, for example, you have a self-driving car. The software has been trained to detect objects on the road, but then all of a sudden the software does not recognize an object on the road because it's not positioned in the normal way. So, and then it does not understand it's an object, so it's unintentionally harmed because the car crashes with the tree or crashes with something on the road, and it was not meant to be. So these are minimizing this kind of way, which is basically means validating technically that the AI system is able to capture as many possible error situations. The other thing would be when you have so-called adversarial attack. So people or situation where intentionally they try to use the AI, attacking the AI for manipulating the output. And that means, defending yourself. And that means that, this principle has to do with resilience to attack and security. So cybersecurity is certainly a topic here: hacking, attacking data, attacking the model, and attacking the infrastructure, data center, the software, the hardware. So this is really goes into a very strong technical part that is basically saying the system should be protected against attacks. And these are called adversarial attacks, where people with bad intention are using technique for corrupting the AI. Another thing that is important to understand that, as every technology, AI is an advanced technology, and it can end up being used, here it's called dual use, meaning it can be used for good, it can be used for bad. And the bad is really the potential malicious use by actors that want to use it for harming people or manipulating people. Think of fake news, where you can alter election, you can alter a war and stuff like that. Anyway, so here I go a bit faster because then you have a few things that they require on the technical space. And again, this part will be an assessment of the potential risk associated for safety and security of using this system. One important thing under this principle is accuracy. Accuracy is extremely important because how accurate is the AI system to make certain outputs? So if the system is very accurate and is predicting, for example, in 99% of the cases, a particular disease, that would be an accurate system. If the system is 99% accurate on one class of people, but the minority is really not very accurate, then you have this trade-off. You have a system that is very accurate on one class, is not accurate on the other one, and you go back to the fairness problem, which is another principle. And of course, this is, depending on how the system is used, it might affect life for people. So that, again, you might want to make sure that if the system is using medicine and the doctor is making a decision thinking that this patient has a particular disease, that the AI is accurate. Or it doesn't have too many so-called false positive or false negative. So false positive and false negative are normally technical terms used by defining an AI system that thinks that you have a disease, but there is no disease, or it doesn't think there is a disease, but in reality there is a disease. And which one is better? You prefer a system that is signaling too many times there is a disease when there is none, and you might end up having maybe a treatment when it's not necessary, or you want a system that sometimes does not catch a disease and then you might die because the AI system was not predicting that. So these are the trade-off of accuracy, which is not easy and has to be well documented. So I skipped that one, because it's all the technical part. And we go to the third principle, which probably is more related to your field, because as a legal scholar, you are also involved with privacy and data governance. And basically this again is connected to the prevention of harm, and privacy is very connected to that. And it has to do with several things, among them the quality and the integrity of the data being used for training this system. You have to understand that for those of you who are not completely familiar with how AI system works, an AI system is like a child. He has no knowledge, and somebody has to train this child by giving them example. And you give an example, and depending on the system, then you try to teach the AI if this is good or this is bad. If this is a disease, this is not a disease. If there is an object, you shouldn't go against it, and stuff like that. Depending if the data is of poor quality, then you have bad learning, and you cannot really do something accurate, and then you go back to accuracy. So But how do you know if the data is good or bad? Because when you use it, nobody's going to tell you which data has been used. So you see, that's another important thing. Privacy and data protection are clear because in Europe, at least we have a GDPR, which is a law that tells you exactly what to do with data, or at least on paper, and privacy. So AI systems should basically guarantee privacy and data protection for the entire life cycle of the system. This is more difficult because you have to look at the quality and integrity of data. And it goes back to biases because the data might have socially constructed biases or have mistakes and errors. So basically, this is really an important part to how do I verify if the system that I'm now either using it or I'm supposed to use does not have a socially constructed bias inside. There's been cases of AI system being used and then people understood that the system was biased. How the data is accessed, so who has access to the data, is the data private, is the data public? And then the fourth principle is transparency. Now, bear with me, the fourth principle is not called explicability, it's called transparency. That's the reason for that, because basically this is linked to the principle of explicability, so the ethical principle of explicability. And they have sub-requirements. So for example, are you able to trace? So can you document how the process of learning or labeling the algorithm was made? So is any way that you can trace back how the system was actually designed and implemented? Because it could be useful for auditability as well. Explainability, are you able to explain the output? Not always. It depends on the system. There are certain systems that are more easily explainable, others are not explainable at all. If you are able to explain, you can understand more about accountability. And of course, it depends if the system is impacting people's life. The more they impact people's life, the more you might want to have an explanation of how the system works. And that means that you should have at least some communication. So for example, AI systems should not represent themselves as human to user. If it's a chatbot, it should be defined as such. The fifth principle is called diversity, non-discrimination, fairness. Obviously, these requirements is related to the ethical principle of fairness. And here they have sub-requirements. So one is avoidance of unfair bias. Now, that means it's also connected to understanding how the system's being trained, the data. And if you're using this system, you are doing unintended harm by prejudice, discrimination, a certain group of people, and things like that. So you can see harm is the key, identifying the effect, and putting in place mechanism to inform if you think that this system is unfair. The other one is accessibility and universal design. For example, if you have a disabled minority, if the system being used also, it'd be actually fine also with this societal group. And stakeholder participation. So that's a wish, you know. The wish would be that when you are defining and designing the system, it would be important if a category of stakeholders are actually involved in order to give feedback. Normally, this doesn't happen. It's very unlikely that you have citizens being involved in the design of high-tech technology. Think about it, all kinds of products that you're using. the involvement of stakeholders is a very crucial but very complicated process, because you need to define who are the stakeholders, how do they get involved, and stakeholder participation is actually quite an important point. 6, societal environmental well-being. Here, the European Commission has been trying to widen their eyes and simply not looking at the technology as a technique, but also looking at the implication on the wider societal context. Again, it's connected to the principle of fairness and prevention of harm. You have all kinds of initiatives like sustainable development goals. And basically, you can see here that this requirements is basically saying whether the use of AI is sustainable, for example, for the environment, environmentally friendly, and is not only the AI at the end, but also if the AI is used in the supply chain, the entire supply chain, because the AI could also be used for optimizing processes, and basically it's part of a chain. And then social impact. So social impact is extremely important and extremely difficult to measure, because what is the impact of the use of the AI on people's life, physical, mental, emotional well-being? That's really a challenge, because you cannot really easily measure, like, for example, accuracy, because accuracy is connected to statistics. You can say 99% of the case is right. Well, it's a measure. But how do you do well-being, for example, mental well-being or emotional well-being? But that's important as well. And here is another hammer, because inside this sub-requirements, you have society and democracy. Now, if you think about it, this is really a hammer. Hammer means that, is really hard, because if you show this to other areas in the world where this is not the focus, then you immediately have a problem. So the European Commission's course is based on Western democracy, and basically you might want to have an AI system that is respecting the societal into the Western democracy spirit, including all the democratic processes, including electoral context. And you can even see how a system can be used for manipulating democratic process. So there's a danger there. The last principle is accountability, which I think is connected to the principle of fairness, and basically has to be checked before and after deployment, and is basically rooted in fairness again, to ensure a clear line of responsibility and accountability for the output of whatever. You don't really make accountable the software, you make accountable the people that have been using the software for making a decision. That's a very important distinction. So accountability has a few sub-requirements. One is called auditability. Auditability entails the enablement of the assessment of the algorithm, data, and design process. It could become a law. So you have auditors that will be then required to audit a particular system. At the moment, there is no law. Then you have minimization, reporting negative impacts. Could be a risk assessment, a documented risk assessment. For example, in the form of algorithm impact assessment. Again, this could become part of the law. And trade-off. Basically, when you see that there are certain situations where there is not a clear solution, you have to make a trade-off, either this or that, and make a clear decision and see what are the consequences for this decision. When it's possible. If there is no trade-off, you shouldn't use the system. If conflict arises, trade-off should be explicitly acknowledged and evaluated in terms of their risk to ethical principle, including fundamental rights. So that's actually the philosophy. And that could be done continuously over the cycle. Last sub-requirements of accountability is the ability to redress. When something seems to be going wrong, you should be hopefully able to undo the damage. There are a couple of challenges and limitations of these guidelines. First of all, these guidelines are not law, and they are not specific of a particular domain. So they're not for healthcare, the financial market, they're general. They even have created a checklist. If you're interested, I can send you some information. There is a checklist created by the EU that can be done for self-assessment. There are a bunch of questions you can answer, and then you got the score, but nobody is checking the validity of your answer. So it's a totally self-assessment without any validation. And they don't give you any information on what kind of things like fairness you should use. You should then decide things like fairness, case by case, domain by domain. And the guidelines are not really telling you how to do a legal assessment. So, Sang-Yoon, I don't know if you want to do a little break of 5 minutes before I start with the second case, or you want me to continue?
Well, so how about having five breaks?
5 minutes break sounds great. So we'll reconvene in 5 minutes, and here I will tell you a little bit about what can we do in practice from this kind of guidelines, how to do something in practice. So in 5 minutes, we continue then.
Okay, then let's meet again at 9:05.
Yeah.
So we have about
Very good.
7 minutes,
Excellent.
7-minute break.
Okay, excellent. So welcome back. I hope that the 5 minutes were sufficient to regenerate a little bit. I understand there's a lot of material. You have to understand that this is what the European Commission has written into reports. And now think about it. I mean, this is really the interesting thing is now you have this report, which has guidelines, principle, ethical values, requirements, a checklist. But how do you make use of that in practice? So suppose that you are now helping a case where somebody is unhappy about a particular AI system that was used in medicine or in finance or in justice or whatever. How do you make a decision whether the use of this AI system was trustworthy or not? So basically, this is what I would like to explain you very briefly. This is the work we've been doing in the last almost 3.5 years. And we come up with a process to define when you have an AI system, the 4 parts: ethical, technical, domain-specific, and the legal implication of using an AI that is into a given context. So let me explain you very briefly so then you get a feeling. Besides that, we're trying to come up with having more collaborators. So if some of you becomes interested in getting in touch with me about this work, you can talk to Professor Senwok and he will likely be able to connect it with me. And basically this process can be used in the entire AI life cycle, which is really 4 parts. You know, when you're talking about AI life cycle, then you have the part where people design it, they have an idea. They develop it, so they do some software development, training, testing. They deploy. This is very important. From here to here, somebody has given the okay from going to a laboratory to a real life. This is the moment of truth. This is the moment where somebody comes and says, you are the manager of a hospital. Shall we use it in our radiology department? Or shall we use it into our justice? And by you done this, then you might have consequences. So these 2 parts, you try to avoid problems before. You monitor what happened, and monitor over time is extremely important because the AI system is learning sometimes automatically by developing. So it's like a child that is learning to walk and then is by experience is walking more and more. Now, we've been learning this process by working on real cases in healthcare. We've been looking at an AI for predicting cardiovascular risk. We've been using this assessment for validating the use of AI in the city of Copenhagen, that is using an AI system for their healthcare emergency call 112 to recognize cardiac arrest. We've been using it in co-design, so with engineers that they were developing a deep learning system for detecting skin lesion or cancer. And recently we finished an assessment with a hospital in northern Italy where they use a deep learning system for radiology department for COVID patient to detect the compromise of the lung of the patient. So we did that. You see, this is work that started in January 2019. We have 4 cases. They are all, these 3 are all published. This will be soon published. And based upon that, we learn a process. We use a so-called holistic approach. So we don't only use checklists, but we have a more holistic ways of involving. And we involve stakeholders, meaning that we create an interdisciplinary team of experts that are working all together to do it's a self-assessment. So, and we use social technical scenario to identify what we call issues. In some other literature, these are called risk. But you have to think about it. So you do now a self-assessment together with the relevant stakeholder. It could be a hospital, for example. So you take the relevant people in the hospital, and basically you sit on the table or virtually on Zoom, and the team of interdisciplinary experts that is basically composed of a variety of experts from philosophy, applied philosophy, to domain experts, to engineers, social scientists, behavioral scientists. They sit together and they try to analyze the system by looking at these 4 parts. What is the aim of the system? Why is it being done? Who are the actors and their expectation and interaction? The processes where the AI system is used for what? The technology being used and the context. And the idea is that you start describing this in terms of social technical scenarios with the goal to identify possible issues that need to be assessed. If a system has already been deployed, you're doing an assessment of a system already in production. If a system is in design, you're doing a so-called co-design. That's a big difference. Now, when you validate a system, most of the time, if the system has been developed and implemented by engineers, maybe there's a company who implements it, whatever, there are so-called claims. A claim is, for example, our system is very accurate. It will help radiologists to spot certain problems. Or our system is more accurate than the human that normally do this job on his own. Our system is very safe. Our system is very fair. Now, these are claims. We should learn to look at all of these assumptions as claims. When you have a claim, then you have to, first of all, understand the claim, understand the technological capability and limitation, and build a stronger evidence base to support the claims. So, for example, suppose that they say, our system is actually very accurate. It will be able to predict a heart attack of every person with great precision. Then you have to challenge this as a claim and say, what is the evidence? Then you have to define what is an evidence. An evidence could be, for example, literature of a study or clinical study that's been published and peer reviewed that are actually supporting the claim that if you use a particular parameter for validating heart attack, this is working, for example, for all population. Or you might end up having contradictory evidence base for the same claim. And that's a very important notion that you need to have a consensus-based mechanism even between experts. Experts can be medical doctors of different kinds. And the evidence base should possibly involve representative of society, of the citizen. Now, when we have this process, we let the experts describe in what they think is a problem with this system. So they define what they call issues with their own terminology. Now, there's a catch. A legal scholar talks different than the machine learning engineer, talks different than the medical doctor that is specialized, talk different from the medical doctor that is like a general practitioner, talk different from a policymaker, talk different from a philosopher. If all of them talk and describe, they might use terminology and concepts that have overlapping different meanings, and you cannot really come up with a consensus because you are lost in the discussion. Our attempt is basically say we're using this framework that I explained you in an hour, the 4 ethical principles and the 7 requirements. How do you map it to that? And we let them map with their own terminology into the ethical principle and the requirements. And in order to do that, we force this mapping in the close vocabulary of the 4 ethical principle and vocabulary. So this mapping is from text to principle and requirement. And this is quite difficult because it requires a consensus-based mechanism that could be done manually, where people get together and analyze what they wrote and describe how the map is, prevention of harm, is human oversight and agency. And basically, once we arrive to a list of issues that have been mapped into the requirements of the EU, then we can sort them by relevance. And what is the idea? That we can give a recommendation, because we are not part of an audit, we're not a company, we are simply helping self-assessment, and we can give recommendation to key stakeholders and basically say is appropriate to use, there are risks to be modified and analyzed. We recommend to mitigate those when possible, or you shouldn't use this system. So this is really in 2 minutes. The way it works is basically that we have 3 phases. We start creating a team. And the creation of a team is already an ethical process, because if you have a team that is biased, then the output will not be proper. So choosing the right people, and if it's a self-assessment, how to work with the stakeholders who owns the case is also important. You should verify preconditions such as absence or conflict of interest. That's why it is very difficult to work with vendors. That's why we don't do. We mainly work with public institutions like hospital, and because then if you work with the vendors, you might immediately have in a self-assessment a conflict of interest. Define the boundaries of what you want to assess. Suppose that you are in a hospital and there is a system that is is in use in the radiology department. You're not only assessing the software, you're assessing the processes, you might assess how people make decisions. What is the implication for young radiologists if they use a particular system or not? And so then you have to define the boundaries, how much you want to assess. Once you have that, then you basically have this social technical scenario where we analyze it with this interdisciplinary team. We identify issues, map them with the consensus process on the requirement of the EU, and verify the claims. And keep on doing that until you arrive to a final list. Could be even ethical tension or trade-offs that have to be made, and recommendation. And we stop here because we are not legally binding, but we give qualified information for stakeholders to make qualified decisions. One important thing, which I think is also relevant for you, for those of you who are studying maybe intellectual property, you have to handle and understand if what you are analyzing or assessing has some intellectual property, what it is, how to handle it, and basically decide in the assessment how you want to handle confidential information. There is a tension between, there's inherent tension between, between proprietary information and disclosure. So, but that's something that you also, for those of you who are working in intellectual property, that's a very important case. If you're interested, we have a website that contains all the use cases, the processes, also the lecture that we did with Sun Wong last year together. So there's plenty of resources there. And if you find something interesting that sounds interesting to you, please get in contact with me. I skip that because I want to finish in the last 10 minutes with very quickly the third part, which is how the EU is trying to create a legal framework, so a law. There's been a press release last year announcing the first attempt to do a law. You have to understand the layers of legal and ethical regulation. At least in Europe, you have the GDPR, which is kind of into that space. And all of a sudden, and then the domain-specific law like medical and law. And now we have a proposed AI Act. It's not yet a law, but the motivation, again, this is a quote from the Vice President of the European Commission, is to really create a system that has trust in it. Now from the legal perspective, not more from the guidelines ethical perspective. So it's the very first legal framework for AI that has to be approved by all member states, so it will take quite a bit of time. And they have some interesting definition. You know, they define an AI system in a very general manner, which contains a lot of software that is not necessarily only the classical machine learning. And this is basically what they have. You know, it's machine learning, including deep learning, and also classical logical knowledge-based concept that are old school, and even statistical approach. But the real core is this one here. Now, the interesting thing is that this law is based on the so-called risk-adapted regulatory approach, which has been also proposed by the German Data Ethics Commission, which basically said the greater the potential for harm, the more stringent the requirements and the more far-reaching the intervention by means of regulatory instruments. There is a comment. Of course, you know, we are now in the States. So you see, you can already discuss, you know, too strong regulatory instruments, less innovation, too much innovation, a risk of harm. That's the usual problem that we have. The European viewpoint is taking the first one. And basically, you have a risk pyramid where you try to classify AI system by level of risk. You know, here in the bottom, minimal risk. Here is limited risk, high risk, system that shouldn't be deployed at all. So, and the EU in the law is already defining statically, that's actually a weakness of the law, but it's still a proposal. They identify system as a high risk, meaning we are here. Including AI technology using critical infrastructure, for example, transport, could put the life and health of citizens at risk. Self-driving cars, for example. Educational or vocation training that might determine the access to education and professional courses somebody's life, like scoring of exam in school, using AI for scoring. Safety components of product, for example, AI application in robot assisted surgery. Employment, workers management, and access to self-employment. So, for example, software for analyzing curricula for people using HR. Essential private and public services, for example, credit scoring, denying citizens opportunity to take a loan. Law enforcement that might interfere with people's fundamental rights. For example, evaluation, the reliability of evidence. Migration, asylum, and border control management. For example, verification of authenticity and travel documents. These are all classified in this proposed law as a high risk. Administration of justice and democratic processes. Clearly, this is your field. For example, applying the law to a concrete set of facts. These are all classified as high risk. Now, high risk will be subject to strict obligation before they can be put on the market. That's what they say. They have identified extremely high risk, all remote biometric identification system. So this is on top of the pyramid. And higher risk system will have obligations. So the vendor will have to do adequate risk assessment and mitigation, and they need to prove that they are using high quality data set. But that's the law. You know, somebody has written it. How to do it in practice, another story. You see here, you have the same terminology that we use in the guidelines, but now this becomes part of the law. You know, avoiding risk, minimizing risk, discrimination, something like that. Login activity to ensure traceability. You see, you're using a lot of this terminology in the guidelines now in the document here. Documentation, clear communication to the user, appropriate human oversight to minimize risk. You see the clear link with from the requirements to the guidelines to the law. High level of robustness, security, and accuracy. You see, you're now taking some of those and put them into law. Limited risk. How do you minimize risk? Transparency obligation. See, now you can see how this law is highly based on the trustworthy framework that we saw. And this is a draft. It's not yet a law. And there's also the necessity to create a so-called European Artificial Intelligence Board with members of each committee. So this is in the AI governance situation. And voluntary code of conducts are proposed for not high risk, as well as so-called regulatory sandboxes to facilitate response innovation. Regulatory sandboxes are an instrument being used when you want to test some technology that is not being proven yet, and you try to limit it to a certain thing. And this is all the government situations, the US private entity. So this is basically from the Federal Minister of Economy in Germany, the definition of what is a regulatory sandbox, but it was actually introduced first in the UK. And it's basically a limited place and a limited time where you can experiment and learn and see whether the technology is beneficial or it has too many risks. Very important, what they are aiming to is to have conformity assessments for products. For example, in healthcare, there would be conformity assessment required by law and done by so-called notified bodies or agencies that are appointed by the EU. And for healthcare-related systems, which are not medical devices, but they are high risk, it would be basically conformity assessment being done by the manufacturer, who bear the responsibility of the assessment. You see, there's a lot of interesting questions here in terms of. And this basically finished my presentation, because you have to remember that in Europe, we also have a general data protection regulation law, which basically connects data. So here we are talking about more than data, because we're talking about the processes, the method, and the GDPR is basically, you have the data privacy issues, you have the consent issues, and you have the profiling issues that are all part of GDPR. The information consent and the certain purposes. So collecting data and right to portability. So these are all things that are part of the law. And I would say I'm actually finished with my presentation. I was trying to give you these three things. Why do we need trustworthy AI? What the EU has done in terms of guidelines, our experience of doing it in practice, and where the EU is going in terms of proposed law. And with that, I think I'm finished with my basically presentation, and happy if there are any question or anything you want to discuss. I leave to Sen Yong to moderate whatever you think is appropriate. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Roberto Ciccarelli. So thank you for your wonderful presentation. So I firmly believe that with your lecturing, so my students have come to get a deep understanding of how the topics of AI ethics are kind of discussed and applied in their EU domain. So that was such a wonderful lecture. So students, so is there anybody who has questions or discussion topics? So freely notify me your will. So 이보형. So Roberto, so you remember, so lawyer Lee was
Yeah.
to be my former assistant at the last year class.
Thank you for your lecture, and it will be really an honor to get your lecture again in this class. So I'm following the SME Data Science last semester lecture. My name is Lee, assistant of Professor Paul. And as you mentioned, I totally agree with your assumption that the needs of self-assessment model or self-assessment tool in practice for structuring trustworthy AI. In this context, I have a question that, are there any other developing tools or trials like that inspection to assess trustworthy AI in practice until now? So if then, what is the core uniqueness compared to other tools?
If you could repeat the question, because I hear you very low, so I couldn't really, I understood somehow, but if you can speak a bit louder, that would be nice.
Can you hear me now?
Yes and no.
But you need to volume up a little bit, so because we have some difficulty in hearing and catching your questions. So you mean, so is there any other kind of tools or applications to analyze and assess trustworthy AI other than G-inspection? Is that correct?
Oh yeah, so that's the question. So thank you. This is, there is a lot of interest nowadays because of this proposed law. So the interesting thing is that when the EU has defined the trustworthy AI guidelines, were not a law, and the incentive for companies to, or even administration to do it, was left to the people. So now all of a sudden the EU has clearly made a statement that what they have done in the guidelines, as you saw, lots of these things are going to be a law. Maybe in 2 years' time, there will be a law regulating AI. So what happened is that you have a lot of initiatives that are now either commercial, so companies like, they want to do a business out of that, or they have domain-specific initiative. For example, insurance. So just to mention one, they write papers how to do assessment on trustworthy AI for insurance. So basically, there's a lot of information and material. I think we are one of the few, if not the only one, that is not commercial. And we publish everything under Common Creative for non-commercial use. So all our cases are, you can download it. And it could be an example that other people can use. There's certain initiatives that are trying to do certification of AI. But the problem with certification that somebody has to basically say who is allowed to give a certificate, because everybody can say, I give a certificate, but it should be some kind of legally binding certificate or government-based. So there's a lot of initiative in papers for assessing. There are lots of initiatives on certification. I'm happy to provide a couple of links to Professor Seung's work, in case somebody is interested, because there's been the IEEE, for example, has come up with the certification mark. So there's a lot, is quite confusing because there is no standard. So you see, but there's a lot of interest because people will say they fear that AI will be regulated very soon. And again, there's this always this tension between regulation and innovation. Too much innovation, too many risks, too much regulation. And this is really one of the problems with the law, is that the law is giving a list of risk assessment statically, but they don't really look at what happened when the system is over time in place. So the law is now being subjected to changes. So if you're interested in this area, I suggest to follow all the process. I think I can send you some maybe link, because the law has been now discussed. It will be changed, but eventually there will be another GDPR, maybe in a couple of years' time.
So thank you, Roberto. So I hope this was like perfect answer to Mr. Lee's question.
Thank you for your answering.
Okay, so maybe we can have 2 or 3 other maybe questions.
Hi, Professor Chikari. I'm Kelly. I work at Twitter Korea, and thank you for your great presentation and briefing. And I'm just wondering, so in your perspective, do you think EU or I mean, do you think we really need this AI law that EU has just proposed? How necessary it is to have such law in such a short period of time? I mean, don't we need to have a long-term discussion and see? I mean, what I think is that, of course, we have these guidelines, but I think maybe it's too early to have a law on AI. And I just want to know what your perspectives and views are.
Well, thank you. This is really a complex question, because depending on whom you ask, you will get different answer. So if you ask me personally, I really believe that Europe is doing something important, because it's setting a guidelines of defining a possible regulation. Because if there is no absolutely any regulation, AI could become really out of control. So having said that, obviously the EU has also a very strong root in fundamental rights, which is really the base for this law. In terms of the timing, I don't think it's that fast, because now it's only a draft. It has to go through a very complex process where all the governments in Europe will have to review it and change it. So in Europe, a law, it doesn't happen in one day. GDPR took a long time. So, but I think this is a statement that Europe is making to the rest of the world, saying AI is great, but we need some kind of clarity. The problem is that any law, first of all, as you know, is neither perfect nor is covering everything that you want. So I think it would be interesting to see, when they have a law, what does it mean in practice? GDPR is a law, but implemented in practice is not the same thing. So I would be extremely interested to learn what other countries are doing. I don't know if in Korea there is any discussion in that, but in the States, the States is always on regulation and innovation. They tend to prefer innovation, which is good. At the same time, when innovation is not controlled, you might end up having all kinds of issues that you cannot really assess, So the short answer is, I think is good. I think that the law will change a lot of things, at least in Europe, but it also will have an impact, because the AI is mainly done outside Europe. That's actually the funny thing. So most of the AI is done in the United States, in China, and maybe some other place. And funny enough, the European system is based on certain values and law. It would be extremely interesting to see what happened, because there's a lot of non-technical issues involved, including if I use a particular AI system developed in a particular country, or if I export a particular AI system. There's nothing really new except that the AI is posing the problem that most of the time you cannot explain why the AI is working. That's why they have a law. But I would be extremely interested to at least learn. Maybe I should learn something from your class on, what is actually the perspective in Korea. So, and since I'm planning hopefully to be in Korea in the fall, it would be amazing if we could have a conversation on that, because then I'm also learning something more on that. Thank you.
So thank you, Roberto, for your answers. So following your answers, let me briefly introduce the topics and overview of this class. So would this be helpful for you?
Yeah.
So I know and understand that Professor Chikari is already learning to Korean languages step by step. But so for efficiency purpose, I will briefly introduce in English. So this.
Thank you.
Yeah. So this is class about AI ethics and regulations, because this is class in the law school. So and the one is the overview. So the AI ethics and regulation is critical and very important in modern days. Number two is saying that you, Professor Chikari, will do your wonderful lecturing in the middle of the semester. And you can find that the G inspection references in a kind of class materials. Actually, so now the students are thinking about and delving into their kind of trying to find out research topics on the AI ethics and regulations. And this is kind of exemplary information to help students find their own topics. So the first topic is AI regulation governance and regulatory policy. And following is the reference materials. Some are in English and some are in Korean, so papers and books and related issues in trend in Korea. So the second topic is the the possibility of legal identity of AI. So this is somewhat partly discussed in Korean legal academia also. And the third main topic is the AI, artificial intelligence and administrative law. So we are kind of the public law class. So the administrative law and regulation is the key part of our interest. And the fourth topic is the AI and the privacy issues or self-information decision-making issues, because this was the beginning part of this big data and AI and in the past. And the fifth issue is the artificial intelligence and self-driving car issues. So kind of technical technology and law issues. And the sixth topic is machine learning and regulation on algorithm. So about this, you also briefly mentioned about. The seventh topic is the Medicare or Medicare AI and digital healthcare topics. Actually, the lawyer Lee Bo-hyung finished his wonderful PhD dissertation last semester. So we write these topics. The eighth topic is the EU's AI regulation. So your lecturing today will be surely help a lot for the students to prepare these topics. And the ninth topic is the AI regulations of China and Australia. So, I mean, other than EU and United States, so right, China, Australia, maybe Singapore or Korea. So they are also playing some role in AI deliberations. The 10th topic is the artificial intelligence and chatting service issues, because in Korea recently, so there was provided some AI chatting applications, and there was quite how to say hot topics or scandals, because the name was Iruda, and it was somehow providing or following the biases or differentiation nature of human beings, and so how to regulate these issues was hotly debated. And the 11th issue is the artificial intelligence and financial regulations and fintech industry issues. So we know AI will change a lot, so in this industry field also. And the 12th topic is the artificial intelligence and legal tech. I mean, so how much the legal service or lawyers or court trial can be subsidized or substituted by artificial intelligence. This is also an important topic. And the 13th issue is artificial intelligence is the change of labor market or labor circumstances. So another interesting issue. And the 14th topic is the artificial intelligence and biases or differentiation issues. And the 15th issue is artificial intelligence and ethics governing system. So actually you did almost everything about this topic today. And the 16th issue is the artificial intelligence and platform industry issues or recommendation algorithm in platform like service or industry. And so, yeah, this is end of this document. And so you can see that we are trying to deal with kind of the holistic or most trendy topics and AI issues, not just from the legal perspective, but also maybe in technology or social science issues. So I hope that this information can help you better understand how and what is going on in Korean, maybe academia and in industry.
Thank you. There's a lot of material covered, so there's a lot of information that students will need to learn and digest. So, well, thank you.
So maybe when you visit Seoul coming this year, so I hope we can have maybe more deeper discussions and maybe try to find collaboration chances.
Oh yeah, that would be extremely nice. Yes, we talk about it. Yes.
And actually, so now we are almost running out of time. So, but before wrapping up this class, so is there anybody who wants to raise questions or comments? So how about Choi Ji-won?
I do not have any concrete questions right now, but what I found from today's lecture was that actually there are already quite concrete ethics rules or some kind of points that we have to consider regarding AI system and governance. Previously, I didn't know that you had such an amount of discussion regarding this topic, but now I found out we actually have some points we need to consider when you want to set up regulation regarding AI. So maybe this semester, based on what you explained today, I want to pick a specific topic and start deep study about that. So really thank you for your class today.
Thank you.
Okay, so there was warm thanking word from Chue. We have a question from Anna Hanbyul.
Thank you, Professor. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
No
My
problem.
question is, thank you for your lecture once again. My question is closer to a practical one than a legal one. As a policymaker in the government, striking a balance between protecting the data and promoting development of AI really is a conundrum. I'm rather concerned considering the fact that we need to feed AI with sufficient data, for instance, to promote its machine learning mechanism and thus development of AI. Our efforts to protect data, maintain human oversight, may potentially hinder AI development. Compared to countries such as China that have no restriction in collection and utilization of AI. And only when countries like European Union maintain position of preeminence in the field of AI, can they continue to maintain the leading role in ensuring that AI remains under human control. So, Professor, would you say that GDPR and proposed EU AI Act strike a balance between protection of data and promotion of AI development, and thus will allow EU to maintain preeminent position in the AI in the long term, especially in the context of power competition between China and US?
Well, thank you for this question. This is not an easy question. Your question has many questions, from the European perspective. I mean, these are all my personal viewpoints, so I'm not representing the European Commission, neither I'm a policymaker. I believe that, and I was often in the States, so I'm fully aware of the state of development of AI in Silicon Valley, not even comparable with what we have in Europe. So most aware of the amount of energy that China is putting into AI. And so now you have, and I know less about Korea, so that's why I would be extremely interested when I'm in Korea to learn from you more. But you have to understand that we are talking about 3 areas of the world with completely different settings. So Europe has a long tradition of fundamental rights and human rights. It's not perfect, but the Western democracy. The States has their own way where, for example, on data protection, they are much less strong than European. So the GDPR had an impact also on this issue of what to do when an American company that is owning all this data, but the data comes from Europe. So, there's all of these issues of where data goes, and privacy seems to be more an issue in Europe than in the States. Now, you mentioned China, and this is a very delicate topic because ultimately you are not talking to the same level of political system, and as soon as you start mentioning to people things that the EU has come up with, like fundamental rights, then you immediately have a problem. So already the starting point of the whole regulation is based on issues that are extremely delicate. I have my own opinion on that. I don't want to maybe express it, completely in a public way, but I think that there is a responsibility for all of us to discuss how do we want to handle with ecosystem in the world that are not respecting maybe human rights or something like that. And this has very little to do with AI because, it's more to do with more general. So the answer is that, yes, there are also concerned that if you have too much regulation, you will not have a lot of innovation. At the same time, I think that Europe is on the leading edge, at least in explaining showing to the rest of the world that some level of regulation is needed. How this regulation functions in practice is a completely different story. So you can have a law, as you know, you're the specialist, but then what does it mean in practice? So I think it's a learning curve. We can all learn, and I'm sure there will be some adjustment, on the way, and especially major political decision to be made, because we are in a society that is all connected, but sometimes, we are connected that we don't really respect what we have on paper. So it's an interesting thing to discuss about fundamental rights and human rights on paper, but then there's a lot of issues that are behind. So I think your question is probably worth an entire session, a panel with experts. Maybe, Senor, you can take it as an input for a panel, maybe to be organized in the future, because that's really an important question.
Okay, so, let's organize some kind of separate conference panel. So when you understand. So thank you for your good questions and wonderful answers. So Anambel, so he's actually working as a government official in Korea. So I understand he's working at the Department of Diplomacy and Foreign Affairs, maybe. So I guess. And the previous questioner, Choi Ji-won, so she's working as a acting lawyer in a major big law firm in Korea. So maybe lastly, so we can have maybe one or two more questions or comment and let Robert. Nope. Okay, so then, so we are all sharing that and sharing the feeling that Professor Robert G. Curry's lecturing was such a wonderful, and so how the AI ethics issue is really understood and treated in European domain. So he provided us to cutting edge information and trend and prospect about the future. So we can give him the big applause for the appreciation. Thank you, Robert, for your wonderful questions, wonderful lecturing.
Well, thank you for the invitation, Senor, and also thank you for this very qualified audience. So it was my privilege to be able to share. And if you have comments afterwards or questions afterwards, feel free to send it to me. I will send you afterward a copy of the presentation so you can share it with your students as a PDF. And I hope that this was useful for your future development and for your work. And I'd be happy to learn more about the output of this class. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So finally, so I have one idea that, so how about sharing this video clip, so your lecturing and previous my teaching, so even though that was in Korea. So I think that was such a high quality discussions and knowledge on AI. So maybe we can share. So I can share these contents to Roberto. Maybe you can share to JIT inspection maybe website or and maybe in this class we can share these contents if everybody is not opposing this idea. What do you think?
Well, me personally, I'm happy to do that. So we can certainly do that.
Okay, so is there any students who are not agreeing on this idea? Nope. So we will take kind of opt out way of so gathering agreeing. So anyway, so thank you again for your excellent and wonderful lecturing. So we are all, yeah, deeply sharing thankful mind to you and your time. Okay. So let's call it a day.
Thank you, and a good evening, because for you it's late, so actually.
Yeah, this is very good timing for having maybe one glass of wine or beer. So after networking or studying together. So let's do that. Separately.
Okay, have a good evening, everybody, then. And thank you for the invitation.
Okay. So bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
감사합니다.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.